Now, on to tonight's guest. David de Sola is a journalist with experience working at CNN, 60 Minutes, and Reuters, whose work has also been published in The Atlantic, The Huffington Post, and other print and online publications. He has degrees from Tufts University, University of Southern California, and Georgetown University, and he lives in Los Angeles. His newest book, Alice in Chains, The Untold Story, was published just yesterday by St. Martin's Press. And with that, please join me in welcoming David de Sola.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for the kind introduction. So I'm going to try and make this as quick as I can just so we can get to the Q&A, because I think that's going to be much more interesting than just hearing me ramble on. 4 years ago, I was looking for a book about Alice that didn't exist. And at that point, I had the crazy idea that I should do it myself. It's the culmination of everything that I've done in academia and journalism over the last 10 years. I approached this book as an outsider, somebody who was not from Seattle, was not of that generation, did not know anyone here. And put it this way, when Facelift came out in August of 1990, almost 25 years ago this month, I was 11 years old. I was living in the Netherlands and about to start 6th grade. And I watched the grunge and alternative rock scene happen from afar, thanks to the wonders of MTV from '89 to '94 while I was living there. So the band was not involved with the book, though I very much wanted them to be. But I was able to tell their story through several things that made the book come together. One was a review of the existing literature existing published materials about the band and about Seattle, old interviews, books, magazines. The internet was a gold mine, YouTube, video clips, audio clips galore. I also went through public records, police, medical examiners, court documents, whatever I could get my hands on. And I also interviewed my own sources. I had about 80 on the record sources, if my math is correct, some of which are here tonight. And I thank you all for being here. How did I find the interviews? Well, once upon a time, as I tell younger readers and younger people, there were these things called albums. And albums had these little things called liner notes. And if you look at the first two Alice albums, it was pretty much a roadmap of who I needed to track down and see if they would do an interview, and that was a pretty good place for me to start. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who are heroes of mine, once described journalism as the best attainable version of the truth, and I hope I've done that here, but I'll leave that for others to decide. One thing that I also explicitly set out to do while I was writing this book was to write it in a way that anybody could understand it and follow along with the story. You didn't have to be from Seattle or an Alice in Chains super fan to fully get who these people were, what they did, what they accomplished. And so I hope that comes across as well. I had two fears while I was writing this book. The first was that I was going to come up short on material, when it wound up being exactly the opposite. I told some of you earlier, my original proposal was for 100,000 words, and my first draft was about 193,000. The version that you're going to read here is about 135. So it cut it down by about a third. The major findings are all still there, structurally and thematically and everything. I just cut out a bunch of quotes, and it didn't come from any one particular place. It just trimmed everything down. The second fear was about a couple of weeks after I submitted the final draft to my publisher, the Rolling Stone UVA story broke, and it fell apart shortly after. And those of you who aren't familiar with it, it was a story about an alleged gang rape that turns out didn't happen on the campus of the University of Virginia. And the problem there was the magazine failed to vet its source. And so at that point, I got very nervous that I had missed something, or there was some little oversight, and something in my book was off, and the whole thing was going to fall apart. At that point, I literally spent weeks reading and rereading it, trying to poke holes in it. I was essentially fact-checking my own work, which was not a lot of fun, as you can imagine. Ultimately, I literally lost sleep over it. But ultimately, I just had to accept that I'd done all I could, and I had just let it go and go out into the world. A lot of people ask me about what the biggest surprise was in terms of my findings. I would say that how well documented their history was. I thought I was going to have very difficult nailing down certain events or places or people, but for example, I found a complete audio recording of the Alice in Chains show in 1987 at the Tacoma Little Theater, where Jerry Cantrell first heard Lane Staley sing. And I also found an article and an interview with the band in, I believe it was City Heat, that was from January of 1988. That was the first show they ever played when it was still Diamond Live, but it was the first show Jerry, Mike, Sean, and Lane played together. And it was a pretty detailed account, and I think it was their first interview. It was pretty fascinating to read if you can find it. And I also found, and if you look in the books, you'll see a couple of them, there are Polaroids from when the band was recording their demo that got them signed at London Bridge. So those are in the book. There's also a couple of photos of Lane and Demery that were taken not long after they started dating. Those are also in the book. Another interesting finding is that I didn't know about, some of the more interesting stuff was stuff I didn't know to look for that was out there, and I just sort of stumbled onto it by accident. And I think the best example about this would be the story of Lane's middle name. Anybody who hasn't read the first excerpt doesn't even know what it is. He was born Lane Rutherford Staley, believe it or not. And what happened? He later he changed his name to Thomas. What happened? I was interviewing Nick Pollock, his friend and bandmate, they were telling me stories about how they, as teenagers, would tease Jamie, Lane's youngest sister, who was about my age. She would have been about, I guess, 8 at the time, give or take. And so me having been a teenage boy once upon a time, I thought, just as a random throwaway question, I didn't expect anything out of it, but I asked him, did you guys ever pick on each other, tease each other? And he said, oh yeah. And so we were talking, and he tells this story how one time they were in the middle of it, and he just randomly calls him Lance Rutherford Elmer. And in his words, Lane would want to get out of the moving car. That's how much it infuriated him. And he didn't remember what it was, and I just remember thinking that that had to have meant something to him to get that kind of a response. So I talked to Johnny Bacolas and James Bergstrom, the other 2 members of the band, and they told me that that was his middle name and that it was a very touchy subject and that he had sworn into secrecy. I later confirmed that with Ken and Jim Elmer, who are both here tonight. So for those of you who are counting, that's 5 sources. But I still wanted to be extra sure. And later on, I found out in Lane's biological parents, when they got divorced, Phil and Nancy, in the court documents, he is actually referred to as Lane R. Staley. So at that point, I thought I was pretty much good to go to run with that. Needless to say, I think of all the things that are in this book, that's the one that Lane would probably want to toss me from the top of the Space Needle for. As far as the biggest challenge, I think it was the obvious would be not having cooperation with or access to the band. That meant that some people, for whatever reason, they weren't willing to talk to me. Others declined, and that was their right, and I had to respect it. Others were just skeptical. There have been other subpar quality books out there, which shall remain nameless. But so I knew that I had a bit of a hurdle to climb. So what I would do, and in some cases I was successful, in others I wasn't, was I would approach them. I'd say, look, this is who I am. This is what I'm doing. This is my background. I think I can do this credibly and responsibly. Please talk to me. And sometimes they would agree. Sometimes they wouldn't. And that's just the way the process went. Beyond that, but when the people who did agree to talk to me, and some of you who are here tonight, many times they would give me the names of other people who I should track down. And sometimes they would give me 1 or 2 names, they give me contact information. This was basically a Seattle story, so many of the people are from here and still in the area, and they're still connected. So, I call it, it was a Stone Age era social networking. Friends of friends, and several of you were kind enough to make referrals to me, and I appreciate that. And that's what makes this book, I think that's a big part of what makes this book what it is. So let me just wrap things up. I'll just say a couple of things. One unfortunate aspect of the band's history, which I had to tackle, I could not avoid that and have this be a credible book, is the drug issue. And it's unfortunate that it overshadowed other things in terms of who they were as a unit and the individual band members. I'd say that drugs are part of the story, and I try to tackle it as delicately and as responsibly as I could without being sensationalistic or exploitative. But the drugs are not the story, and I can't emphasize that enough. They should not define the band, and they shouldn't define any of the individual members or people who were in that orbit or in that era. And along those lines, the point I would make is, I'd ask all of you to think about, is if people still watch Animal House and Blues Brothers because John Belushi was an addict or because he was just one of the funniest comedians of all time. I'd ask you the same thing. Why do we listen to Alice? I mean, they're still touring, they're still making records. It's a testament to the relevance and power of their work and their legacy. So in light of all that, I'll just say that some of you have read the book, some of you are about to get it for the first time. One thing I'd recommend that is an interesting experience for me anyway, and I think it'll be the same for everyone who reads this. After you've done reading it and knowing everything that's in it, I would tell you, go back and listen to those records again with the benefit of hindsight, and just think about what's going on at the time, with each record, the stories behind each song, how it was made. And I think you'll find a new level of understanding and appreciation for who they are, or in some cases were, and what they did. And with that in mind, I'll just shut up and take your questions.
Hey, shut up.
Okay, come on, anybody? Bueller?
Bueller.
Well, okay, so
So what chapter am I in?
there's an index. Look it up. You look yourself up.
I'll have to buy the book.
Yeah.
Damn it.
So how long the process was this?
How long was the process? Okay, so I did my first trip to Seattle in August of 2011, so almost 4 years ago. I did about I was living in DC, the DC area at the time. I did about 5 or 6 reporting trips during the 3 years I finished it. I turned in the first draft in May of 2014 and went through the review process. The final draft was submitted in October or November of last year. So it took me almost 3 years to finish it, and then another year to get to this point where it actually comes out. So. Duffy?
Can you say why you wrote the book? Because you couldn't find...
There was nothing out there like along the lines of what I was looking for. I was looking for a book on Alice in Chains.
Became a fan, or what?
I rediscovered Alice actually when I was doing summer school and working at 60. What happened was when you go to graduate school, and you're doing summer school, instead they cram 12 weeks, 12 one-week classes into 6 weeks. So what happens? You have to go to class two nights a week for 3 hours at a time, which means you have to read about 200 or 300 pages a week, basically, to keep the pace. And on top of that, I was working at 60 Minutes. So what that meant was I had a lot of reading to do, had a lot of homework. And while I was doing that homework one night, I put on the Dirt album for the first time in years, probably, and I listened to it all the way through. And I was like, wow, this is a really great album. And at that point, I was thinking, okay, Lane's passed away, a long time ago, well, 9 years ago at that time, and the band had regrouped. So I thought, maybe somebody has written something by now, and there was just nothing there. And at that point, just the little light bulb went off, and I'm like, okay, that's it, I'm doing it. Literally, it was that simple. Steve.
If you were a street sign, what would you be and why?
Stop. Oh, well, sorry to put you on the spot, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Scott Hunt, founder of the Music Bank, right over there. So, please say hello. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I wanted you to get credit when it was due. So, yeah. So, any other questions? Jillian, go ahead.
I think you saw it, you quoted from Can We Talk to Sean, and he said he felt like Alice in Chains were the redheaded stepchildren of the Seattle scene, like he felt they didn't get enough respect. He had obviously popular band, sold a lot of records. Why do you think they felt that?
Why do they feel that way? Well, it's interesting because if you look at the chronology of events, so if you look at the history, Soundgarden and Mother Love Bone were the first bands to form and get signed. I think Alice were right behind them, so they were like third. But Alice were really the first ones out of the gate. They were the first one to get a video in heavy rotation on MTV. Man in the Box went on MTV Buzz Bin in May of '91, and by September of that year, they'd gotten a gold record. They got a gold record from the RAA for selling 500,000 copies. They were the first of the Seattle bands of that era to do that. Now, keep in mind, of course, September '91, at that time, Pearl Jam's 10 came out in August, Nevermind came out in September, and Bad Motorfinger came out in October, if my memory is correct. So they were the first ones out of the gate. Nirvana, I think, sold more records and they get the most attention because of who Kurt was and his talent and unfortunately by his passing and all the conspiracy theories surrounding that. Pearl Jam also I think they were up there, they sold a lot more records. Pearl Jam also had the distinction of being the only band of those four that continuously kept going for 25 years. So Alice, the issues with Lane and everything, they went on hiatus from almost a decade, 96 to 2006 when they regrouped with William. So, I mean, and that's a long time for anybody, but especially in the music industry. And when they were gone, you saw a lot of bands that cited them as an influence emerge. You had, Stain, Godsmack, many of these, post-grunge bands or whatever who cited them as an influence. And so, I mean, I think their heritage and their legacy is there, but they just weren't there to present it or preserve it, for lack of a better term. And I don't mean that in any negative way. It's just, just the nature of the story. Soundgarden, and they broke up in '97 and they regrouped 5 years ago. So, I think I think Alice, by virtue of the circumstances of their story, they may not have sold as many records. I mean, they had 2 #1 albums and they couldn't tour, which is these days especially, but it's a band's bread and butter. It's unfortunate that when they were at their creative, artistic, commercial peak, when I think the market was probably most receptive to that type of music, when they really could have risen to that level, like a Pearl Jam, where they could, where Pearl Jam were, they basically became an arena and a stadium band and stayed there. So whereas Alice had to. Well, and Alice had to, especially when William came back in, they had to sort of reintroduce themselves, especially to a whole new generation of people who just sort of, during that 10-year period where they just weren't active. And so there was just this gap, and I would guess there's this gap in their audience for a while. Now, hopefully, more and more people have come along in the years since they've been, and now that they've made 2 records as well. So, Bobby.
Yeah, the question I have is, for me, through all the years of playing and stuff, I've always had to have a day job. I've always had to, whenever there's a tour, I've had to take vacation time in order to do it, things so on and so forth. Unless you're on a major label, like Alice in Chains was and so on. The question I have is, when you write a book like this, do you get and I'm not trying to be personal with finances, but do you have to do the same thing? Do you have to have other jobs to write a book, or do you just write a book and you get paid?
Well, interesting, the economics. So I did this on the side from so I started this between my first and second year of graduate school, and during my second year of graduate school, I was doing either school or the book. I was just sort of switching back and forth. I was just able to compartmentalize because there were just 2 different subjects, and when I got fed up with one, I went back to the other, and vice versa. And then later on, I was doing other things. But this was very much sort of something I did on the side from other things. And then when I got my publishing deal, yes, you do get a contract, you do get an advance, etc. And but I mean, again, you're still doing other things. Obviously, I'm not, J.K. Rowling or Stephen King yet, where you can, live off of this thing. But yes, the answer is, don't do this as a day. Don't start on this as your day job, is what I'm telling you.
How big was your loan?
What?
How big was your student loan?
Ooh. Can I plead the fifth on that one? Still. Sorry, go ahead.
How did you know you were done?
How did I know I was done? The advantage of writing nonfiction is that you don't have to make anything up. You just know the story, and I had mapped it out pretty well. And I had set, since my deadline to submit it was submit my first draft was May of 2014. That was my cutoff point. So whatever was the most recent developments up to that point, that was where I was going to leave it. And then, it goes through several rounds of reviews and things like that. There were a couple of things that happened in the months between May and October when I had to finish. So I made a couple of minor updates to that since then. But it's the cutoff point is 2014, and that's how I knew, where it would end. And then as far as everything else, I've read it cover to cover so many times. I don't know, just read it till I thought it felt right, and here we are.
Cool.
Jim.
I understand that you had to cut the book down a bit.
Yeah. Well.
You've already addressed that. Looking back to that 14-year time, not the 14-year time, but is there anything that you regret not finishing out? Looking back on the last couple of years.
In terms of what stuff that isn't in the book, or stuff that I wasn't able to get, or what?
Yeah, just something that you called out the book.
Yeah.
And you had to trim it down.
There were a couple of stories. It didn't. I cut it by about, I guess, around 60,000 words, give or take, so about a third. And it didn't come from one. It's not like I killed like 3 chapters. It came out of everything. So there were stories about the band. There were stories about Baker Saunders. There were stories about Demery. There were stories about Jerry's solo career, things and little things. So it just came out of everywhere. I will say that the essential, the main findings and the central points are all in there. So I mean, if whatever I have left over, if it turns into an article or something that I'll put in to stick in the paperback, or if I do an updated edition down the road, we'll see. There was so the essential stuff is in there. I think yes, I would like some of the stuff to see the light of day more. What I did, unfortunately, had a problem with was there were some photos where we couldn't trace who had the ownership, who had the copyright, and so my publisher just wouldn't let me use them. And it was unfortunate because some of them were fantastic. I had this great photo of Lane and Baker Saunders that was from his private collection that nobody's ever seen before. But because we didn't know who owned it, who even though it was from Baker's private collection and the person who got it from Baker let me use it, he wasn't the copyright holder, at least as far as my publisher was concerned, so we couldn't use it. The same thing happened. Kathleen was kind enough to give me her favorite photo of Demery from about 1988, which would have been more or less around the period that she and Lane first met. And she went to a professional studio, got a headshot done, and she looks great. She's about 19, 20 years old at the time. But because it was the studio that owned the rights to that, we didn't know who that was, we couldn't use it. So yeah, I thought that was more frustrating than any of the text that I had to cut out, though, which is a shame because some of these photos are fantastic. Hopefully people will go back and review their collections, and they'll find some more somewhere.
Yeah, I got a lot.
Okay. Yep. Go ahead.
How do you think the Seattle music scene from the early 80s through the early 90s, or the late 80s through early 90s stacks up in rock history? And where do you think Alice fits into that picture?
Well, I think Seattle is one of a handful of cities in the world where, for a brief moment in time, they just created a sound or a scene that just dominated popular music. London, LA, New York, Nashville is with the country music scene, but Seattle is still there. Now, Seattle is obviously Seattle had produced musicians before grunge, Hendrix, Hart, Queensryche, Quincy Jones, believe it or not, was here for a while. So, whatever you guys put in the water here, it works. And there's still people coming up, and hopefully there'll be a lot more to come. There'll be a lot more to come in the years ahead. as far as its place in overall history, well, I think it was a huge moment at the time. I mean, it was pretty much a sort of a sea change from what I remember. I mean, again, I was middle school, but I just remember, MTV kind of just changed, seemingly in like a week. All these little hair bands to this. I mean, yeah. I mean, Guns N' Roses were the biggest band in the world, but then here comes this little band from Aberdeen, and it turns out that Kurt hated them. But anyway, it was an interesting sort of story of how a bunch of underdogs took over the mainstream, and they sort of set the norm set the tone for a good part of that decade. And three out of the four of them are still ticking, thankfully. So they're keeping that legacy alive. Kathleen, you want to show the photo of Demery so you have it on your phone?
Well, I don't care.
Yeah. Sorry.
I just turned it up.
Oh shoot! Sorry, sorry, I screwed up, Kathleen. Sorry, I screwed up.
I screw up all the time.
So anyway, sorry. Next question. Scott, please.
Did Sean and Jerry have to proof? How does the permission work with all the stories that we've all talked about?
The band was not involved. I would very much have wanted them to be, but this isn't. I'll say this. This is not the first time a book has been written without the participation of its subject. I'm going to give you an example. I mean, do you think David McCulloch interviewed John Adams? Did Mark Bowden, who wrote Killing Pablo, one of my favorite books of all time, you think he interviewed Pablo Escobar? No. I mean, that's what journalists and historians do. They work with what they have available to them. Sometimes you're lucky, like Walter Isaacson, for example, which is the book that had the most profound influence on me writing this. When he did his book on Steve Jobs, he did 40 interviews with the guy, and he had access to I think 120 people. And I would have loved to do something like that here, but unfortunately, it just wasn't the case. But having done the interviews that I did, along with the public records and just reviewing 25 years worth of interviews that Lane, Jerry, Sean, Mike, William, Susan Silver, and everyone else who was in that scene in that era have done, I was able to put it together. And even though they didn't speak to me, they weren't involved, they do have ample opportunity to speak for themselves. So
You're able to use all that information?
yeah, I mean, I had to go through it and try and verify. I was trying to verify as much of it as I could. And I hope it's, as I mentioned earlier, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein called journalism the best obtainable version of the truth, and I hope I've accomplished that. Go ahead.
Out of all the people that you talked to, who had the most heartfelt story?
Wow, everyone's story is pretty amazing. I think, Kathleen Austin, Demery's mom, who's here with us tonight. She was the first interview I did for the project. So, it was pretty moving to hear her speak of Demery, with her health issues and her final days. I haven't said this publicly, but I might as well. I mean, I went back and listened to the tape in my hotel room, and I had to transcribe it because I had to log the transcript so I can use the stuff to write the book. And when I got to that part, I had to put it down. I started crying. It was very, very difficult. It was, I don't know how you told that story, Kathleen, but it just boggled my mind.
I was probably crying too.
Mm-hmm, yeah. So there were a couple of others. I interviewed Dan Gallagher, who was Baker Saunders' next door neighbor, and he, again, he was the guy who had to identify the body, and he was very, and it was very difficult and very, it was a very emotional conversation to have. There were others. There were a few others. But there were obviously stories about just the different issues that were involved there, and people who lived it or saw it in some degree or another. And I just had to be very respectful and treat the subject with the dignity that they deserved, and hope that this did not come across as crass or exploitative or sensationalistic. Whether I accomplished that or not, I leave that up to you to decide, to credibly grade my own work. But I'll leave it at that. Next.
Kind of did the same First of all, my name's Tim. Nice to meet you, David.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. My wife and I moved here from Spokane in 2004. Musically, I came from a band in Spokane and came here to start another one. We ended up finding out Lane had this, or they had this birthday bash, you know, for Lane, a celebration of Lane's life, back in the early days in the DeSoto area. Nancy, his mom, came up to me and asked if she thought she knew me. Any which way we start talking, she didn't know me, but we talked, which was very cool. I was just kind of wondering if your experience was the same as mine or ours. You get kind of caught up in what you read, right? And after a while, reality kind of set in. We started to really talk. We went to her home. She invited us to her home in Whidbey Island. Next thing you know, I was holding his guitar. He played on the Unplugged, MTV Unplugged video. It was great. She's a beautiful lady. She was a wonderful lady. But there was just a very sad sense, kind of what you were talking about, that's hidden, that you really don't see. And then we start talking to more people, and eventually there's a lot of trash being thrown about, you know, his mother really didn't care, you know, for years and years afterwards, kind of just let him go. And it was a wonderful experience to get to know her and to do things with her, but at the same time, I almost regret it not happening because of the info I ended up finding out. So I just kind of, with that being said, the same thing with you. Did you find some stuff out there that kind of really downshift?
Well, I did find out a few things that I didn't want to know. Some of it's in the book, some of it isn't. If that's along the lines of what you're getting at. As far as you know, yeah, and as you know, Lane especially, yes, there were some very difficult things. I mean, I had to tackle the drug issue, but it just the book would not have been credible. It would not be credible. It would be a whitewash if I didn't address it. But you know, just had to be very careful about how it was presented and how I approached it, and I mean, and that it was relevant to a larger point that I'm trying to make. There's nothing in there for shock value. You know, I didn't say I'm not out here to try and embarrass anybody. I'm not out to, you know, trash anybody here. I mean, it's just I'm here trying to tell the story as accurately as I can, and that was sort of my moral compass going into it from start to finish. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Well,
What's your favorite color?
black.
Mine too.
Was listening to a lot of Johnny Cash before it came out tonight.
Bring your fire, baby.
Okay. Well, I think with that, let's wrap up, and I guess we'll just start signing books. Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate it.